I want to introduce Janelle Gottesman, who is the team leader for Palo Alto Prize.
It is my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. It's Dr. Stephen Porges. He is the professor of psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. His research on heart rate variability spans almost 5 decades, and he was the first scientist to quantify heart rate variability and to document its sensitivity to environmental challenges. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Stephen Porges.
Pleasure to be here, and I'm very thrilled to be part of the Longevity Prize event. And what I'm going to talk about, let's see if this works, yes. I'm going to talk about homeostatic capacity through the lens of the polyvagal theory. Well, the polyvagal theory is a theory that I developed to try to explain the adaptive function of autonomic changes and how that can help us in terms of developing interventions and even understanding disorders. But part of what I want to really go through, and this is really the synopsis of what the talk is about, is really that our current models of health are not consistent with the functional rules of the autonomic nervous system. And those rules include feedback, and they're hierarchical in nature. So in a sense, certain systems inhibit other systems. It's a very common principle in the nervous system. And the other part is that in medicine, when there's something wrong with you, you often are assigned a specialist. So you go to a cardiologist, you go to a nephrologist, you go to a GI specialist, and each one looks at you as if the organ is the seat of the disorder. And each one thinks that they can cure this with an acute treatment, when in fact many of these disorders are really disorders of function, disorders of how the nervous system is regulating those organs. And in fact, what we'll learn over time, and you'll see the data on this, is that when people have one chronic autonomic dysfunction or disease, they often have 2, 3, 4, or more. It's not that they have isolated autonomic disorders. One of the things that we forget about the autonomic nervous system is its role in surveillance. First of all, many of you are not scientists, and when we use the word autonomic nervous system, we're talking about the nerves that control the organs inside your body cavity. Your heart, your lungs, your kidney, your liver, your pancreas. And those nerves go in both directions. They go from the brain and from the spinal cord to the organ, and they also go up backwards to the brain. So the autonomic nervous system is a nervous system of surveillance. And whatever we do to that organ, whether we give it an acute treatment or we traumatize it, the information from that organ going to the brain, going to the control center that's regulating that organ is now getting different information and changing how it regulates that organ. Now, when we have machines like cars and they overheat, we're really pretty intuitive about that. We could do something like add more water, but would that solve the problem? Usually it wouldn't. Replace the radiator, it might solve the problem for a few minutes. But if the problem were a stuck thermostat, then it wouldn't matter. So in a sense, adding water is like giving us medicine, or replacing the radiator is like an organ replacement. Does it fix the problem, or does it temporarily offset it? So the whole concept of feedback loop is that you have a regulator. In this case, it's a thermostat, and it's regulating the temperature of the water in the radiator. And to do this correctly, it has to monitor that temperature, and then it has to regulate to keep that temperature at a constant level. So the solution, of course, is if the car is overheating, the first place you'd look is the thermostat. You knock it out, spend the $5, and replace it. And we would do that. However, when it comes to our autonomic nervous system, we tend not to think about the functional feedback system. When there's an organ problem, we think that the organ is defective. And in fact, over time, the organ probably becomes defective because the feedback loop is not working right. This doesn't mean that there aren't cases in which the organ is defective, but it means that the neural regulation, the monitoring and the regulation of it could be defective, and that would result in an increased disease state of that organ. So most diseases of aging are autonomic or at least involve components of the autonomic nervous system, and disruption of feedback contributes to these chronic diseases. And this is actually from Medicare data, and it's quite interesting because the percentage of people with different major chronic illnesses, percentages isn't more than 10%, but most people have, this is one or two other problems, 3 or 4 others, or 5 or more other problems of this system. So it means that if you have one chronic disorder, you probably have several others. So just to remember, the autonomic nervous system regulates the organs, and it basically has 2 major components. One is the sympathetic nervous system, and one is the parasympathetic nervous system. And the vagus, a word that you'll hear a lot about, is the major neural pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system. The way that it has been taught in most textbooks, including medical school, is that the autonomic nervous system is literally a paired antagonistic system. It has a sympathetic, which is really a mobilizer, creates more energy, and you have a parasympathetic, which is assumed to support health, growth, and restoration. In general, some of these ideas are true, but in reality, that's now how our autonomic nervous system responds to challenge. So even though we have dual innervation of these organs to create an optimal tonic state, when we are challenged, our nervous system acts in a different way, and that's what the polyvagal theory gives us. The autonomic nervous system reacts in a predictable hierarchical way, and the polyvagal theory uses evolution as an organizing principle to identify 3 neural autonomic circuits forming a phylogenetically ordered response hierarchy. Now, I'll deconstruct phylogenetic. Phylogenetic means it tracks our own evolutionary history, the evolutionary history of mammals. And what we means is that we have actually inherited circuits from older vertebrate species. And these circuits regulate adaptation to safe, dangerous, and life-threatening environments, meaning that all responses have an adaptive function. But if we're in dangerous and life-threatening environments for prolonged periods of time, we turn off the uniquely mammalian vagal system that is protective for our health. And we'll learn more about this now. As we look at the evolutionary tree, what we want to look closely at is really where the vagus, there's an old unmyelinated vagus comes in, and this really is a shutdown type response. So when cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays, when they didn't have enough food or oxygen, they would just lower the metabolic activity. And for us, that would be like fainting. And then with bony fish, we have a spinal sympathetic nervous system. It's only with the mammals that we have a new myelinated vagus, but that myelinated vagus is very, very special because it downregulates sympathetic and protects us from having shutdown responses from that old vagus. Not only that, the new myelinated vagus is in our brainstem. It originates in our brainstem and interacts with all the nerves that regulate the muscles of the face and head. So in a sense, when our voices are melodic, when our faces are expressive, it's really telling us that the vagal regulation of our heart is good because it's the same system. So we had these phylogenetic stages. The first stage is a primitive unmyelinated vagus that creates immobilization behaviors such as fainting, death feigning even, shutdown, and with people suffering from severe abuse and immobilization, they may actually go into dissociative states. The next stage is the sympathetic nervous system that promotes as a reaction fight, flight, and then the mammalian stage is this myelinated vagus. Myelination is a fatty substance that enables the circuit to work very efficiently and rapidly, and this system, when it's working, enables what's going on below our diaphragm, our gut, the systems that we're not supposed to feel, puts it in balance between the unmyelinated vagus and the sympathetic nervous system to promote health, growth, and restoration. And now for your very quick course in gross anatomy, okay? Here we basically conceptualize the human body as having 3 major structures: a head, a viscera, and a trunk and limbs. And conceptually, each one has its own autonomic nervous system. So you have this new, the old unmyelinated vagus regulating basically your gut, the subdiaphragmatic circuit below your diaphragm. And babies who are born prematurely, one of the risks is apnea and bradycardia. And that is created by this old unmyelinated vagus because the preterm baby doesn't come into the world with a myelinated mammalian vagus, comes in with a reptilian autonomic nervous system, and the response of reptiles to threat is to immobilize and shut down. Good for the reptile, but potentially lethal for humans. And you can see, look at the mouse. That's what I want you to see. The mouse is not dead. People call it death feigning. The mouse is playing dead, but do you think it's a voluntary response? No, it's a reflex. So when the mouse was in a situation where it couldn't avoid, it couldn't run, it couldn't flee, and it couldn't fight, the nervous system shut down with that old unmyelinated vagus. It's very protective. In this case, the cat will lose interest, but if the cat continued to have interest in the mouse and ate it, the mouse wouldn't feel a thing. So then we have this cortical spinal system, which all our athletes in the room know about, and this enables us to flee, to flight, or to fight. It creates this mobilization activities. And then with the head, now we're into the head part of this anatomy, we have the cortical bulbar, which means from the cortex to the brainstem, circuits that regulate all the striate muscles of the face and head and this new myelinated vagus. And then you start seeing these things interplay. And when you see facial expressions that are happy, people's voices being melodic, is really an indicator of the vagal activity working. And another way of conceptualizing this is to think about, in textbooks, they draw pictures of the vagus, but they don't give you a dotted line. That's the diaphragm. And here are the organs above the diaphragm, which regulate the heart and the lungs, and here are the organs below. It's this system that is the myelinated system, and it's this system that produces heart rate variability, the surrogate variable of telling you that the system is working well. And this system, if it's used as a defensive system, is not a good situation. So once that supradiaphragmatic vagus is working, it enables subdiaphragmatically, below your diaphragm, for these systems to support health, growth, and restoration. That's a vagal system, but that is also a vagal system. One is positive and one is negative. So we can't always say that what we want to do is increase vagal activity because we could kill people by increasing vagal activity. We have to know what pathways we want to trigger. So in a sense, we have three polyvagal states: the myelinated vagus that supports social behavior, health, growth, and restoration, a mobilization vagus, sympathetic nervous system, and this shutting down unmyelinated vagus. And this is hierarchical. When the myelinated vagus is working, it down-regulates the sympathetic nervous system, so it calms people down. But if you're mobilized, what happens to your digestion? It's turned off. What I always like to say is, what did your mother tell you to do after eating about not going swimming for a while? Your mother would say, don't go swimming for an hour. And I always say, how did she know about the polyvagal theory? And it's because if you swim, you'll inhibit the digestive process and you'll create cramps because the system won't be working right. And we can see the system played out in terms of behaviors, and where this myelinated vagus produces social, co-regulated calm states, optimal health, optimizes health, growth, and restoration. The sympathetics, if used as a defense reaction, creates fight, flight, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, hypertension, gut problems, anxiety disorders, and drug abuse. And if the unmyelinated vagus is used as a defense system, it results in a behavioral shutdown, dissociative behaviors, and perhaps risks of suicide. And instead of hypertension, now you have hypotension, blood pressure regulation difficulties, vasovagal syncope, which will cause fainting, and even symptoms like fibromyalgia, because the sensory pathways of that unmyelinated vagus interact with pain pathways. So the autonomic nervous system as a hierarchical system provides us with a better understanding of disorders and leads to efficient interventions. And even recently, there was an article in The Science, which is a major scientific magazine, that really showed that the sympathetic nervous system initiates early phases of prostate cancer, while the parasympathetic nervous system, that subdiaphragmatic vagus, is involved in later stages when the cancer spreads, in a sense confirming in the proliferation of cancer that the polyvagal theory provides a very interesting and important explanation. So in a sense, you can see subdiaphragmatically that when that vagal circuit is triggered inappropriately, it can actually cause disease. Now we get into this notion of heart rate variability as a portal to the autonomic nervous system, and we will have to emphasize that that these oscillations in heart rate, which are occurring with breathing, are really our marker variable that the myelinated vagus is working, because when we inhale, in general, the vagal efferent, the vagal pathway to the heart, is blocked or attenuated, and when we exhale, we basically open up that gating and increase the vagal activity to the heart. So on a breath cycle, we can actually get an estimate of that vagal activity of that myelinated vagus. So respiratory rhythms in heart rate, or they are called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, are a sensitive index of the myelinated vagus, and that's that new mammalian supra above the diaphragm vagus that downregulates defense and promotes health, growth, and restoration. But we have to remember, and that's actually the theme of this whole launch, is that aging and chronic stressors reduce respiratory sinus arrhythmia. There's a big literature on this. They reduce heart rate variability. And so the autonomic nervous system, we have to remember, is a feedback system. And this will lead us to ideas of how to enhance health and increase longevity. The ANS is a feedback system that monitors and regulates organs. Faulty feedback in the autonomic nervous system leads to chronic diseases and accelerated aging. Faulty feedback in the autonomic nervous system reduces homeostatic capacity. And the polyvagal theory provides new directions to test interventions that may optimize the functioning of components of the autonomic nervous system to improve homeostatic capacity and to extend quality of life. And what I'm just going to show you, this is my team. I was asked to introduce them. My team is called the Polyvagal Science Team, and there's a reason for that. Because that's the model that we're using. I am the team leader. My background is in the autonomic nervous system, measurement techniques, developing the theory, and over 40 years of heart rate variability research. My team member is Sue Carter, who is a behavioral neuroscientist whose discovery of the role of oxytocin in social behavior has made a major impact on society. And she's also developed the prairie vole model, which is the animal she uses to study oxytocin in social contexts and stressors. We also have collaborated and implanted in these little animals, which are 50-gram animals, the size of a mouse, heart rate telemetry devices, and we were able to demonstrate that the heart rate variability patterns of the vole are just like humans. It's a very good translation model. And if you stress them by isolating them or restraining them, the vagal regulation drops and their heart rates now start looking like mice. And the third member is Bob Navio, who's a MD PhD at the University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego. His expert is metabolomics, neurogenesis, immunity, and he founded the Mitochondrial and Metabolic Disease Center there. So as you can see in our package, we approach this problem in what I call the extended or expanded autonomic nervous system, because the autonomic nervous system is not merely the traditional one. It includes neuroendocrine, it includes the immune system, and the metabolomics becomes our cue or pathway of changing the sensory information going up the vagus and modulating the autonomic nervous system. Collectively, I have that as a footnote, this team has generated approximately 100 years of NIH funding. So we're just very old and persistent. So our approach was, first we formed the Polyvagal Science LLC. This was really designed to engage in innovative research and development that will translate science into new technologies useful to society, consistent with the objectives of the Palo Alto Longevity Prize. And our strategy, as conceptualized by the polyvagal theory, is to, in a sense, work on autonomic nervous system feedback circuits to optimize support growth, health, and restoration by minimizing the involvement of the autonomic nervous system in defensive strategies. The prairie vole will be used because it's a target animal that has an autonomic nervous system similar to humans. Thank you.